It's the real news. I'm Easy Jackson. The state of Missouri almost executed the wrong man on Tuesday. But just hours before the lethal injection was to take place, Missouri Governor Eric Greitens halted the execution of 48-year-old Marcellus Williams. He was scheduled to be put to death for the killing of Felicia Gale, a former St. Louis Post-Dispatch reporter stabbed 43 times during an August 1998 robbery at her home. Williams' attorneys argued that recent DNA evidence showed he is innocent, and Williams has always maintained his innocence. Greitens said in a statement he would appoint a board of inquiry to examine the new DNA evidence and recommend whether he should grant clemency to Williams. The stay came as opposition to the execution mounted. More than 200,000 people have signed an online petition asking the Republican governor to intervene, and a rally protesting the execution was planned in St. Louis later on Tuesday. Now joining us from Kansas City, Missouri, is Kent Gibson. Kent is a criminal defense attorney who has been representing Williams for the past 12 years. He has practiced law for over 30 years, defending individuals who are wrongly accused and incarcerated. Mr. Gibson, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
What was your reaction and the reaction of Marcellus Williams when he was granted a last-second stay of execution last night?
Well, obviously, everyone, Marcellus included, all of his friends, families, supporters, and lawyers were all very happy with what happened. Marcellus, being a devout Muslim, has always been kind of subdued about a lot of this. He believes that his fate is in Allah's hands, and he said the same thing when he was notified of the action yesterday.
It's pretty remarkable because it's rare that somebody's granted stay for execution. I want you to talk about the new evidence that was obtained that showed another man's DNA was on the murder weapon, not Williams.
We've been trying ever since I've been on the case, 10 or 12 years, to get new DNA testing under technology that didn't exist at the time he went to trial. The old DNA testing was limited to testing fluids like saliva or blood, things like that. Touch DNA came into fashion in about 2006, where you can actually get a DNA profile by examining items that an individual has touched. Mm-hmm. And that's what we used in this case to develop a DNA profile on the knife that was left in the victim's body. A DNA profile was developed through Touch DNA that did not match the known DNA of my client. It's an unknown male, but it is not Marcellus Williams.
Now, the Missouri Supreme Court, they declined to stay on the execution based on this new evidence, but the governor stepped in. There's, like you said, there's no physical evidence or testimony tying your client to the crime. The case was based on testimony of two people. Can you talk about why you feel the courts should be skeptical of their testimony?
Well, one of them was what we call a jailhouse snitch or jailhouse informant, which is one of the most common scenarios you see in wrongful conviction cases. It's where a cellmate or another guy in jail basically contacts the authorities and says, so-and-so, the defendant, told me he did it. And then they do it, obviously, in exchange for either getting out of jail themselves, or in this case, he got a $10,000 reward for giving information that led to his arrest. So our opinion, he had 10,000 reasons to lie.
Yeah, Williams is black, and as you said, also a devout Muslim. During the trial, 6 of the 7 black jurors were allowed to preemptively be dismissed by the prosecution, including one who, quote, looked like Williams and worked for the post office. But they had another white juror who worked for the post office and stayed on the trial. How much is race playing a factor in this case?
I think it's played a big part. I mean, anytime you have a white victim from an affluent community and affluent family who's allegedly murdered by an African American. That's the type of case that the prosecutors almost always go for the death penalty, because they and in a venue like St. Louis County, which, by the way, is the same place that the infamous Ferguson shooting place. There have been racial problems with the criminal justice system in a lot of different areas for years. And the prosecution in St. Louis County have a pattern of eliminating black jurors in criminal cases, particularly involving black defendants. Almost every capital case out of there in the last 20 years involving a black defendant, there have been issues about it, the exclusion of African American jurors and being tried in front of all white juries in most cases. And in this case, there's only one African American juror who served in this case.
Oh, wow. And Governor Greitens is calling for this 5-person board to prove the DNA evidence is worth granting clemency. Do we know, or do you know what this board is going to look like?
The only thing we know from his order is it's going to be 5 retired judges. We're a little bit in uncharted waters here, because this statute that allows him to appoint a board has been on the books since the 60s. But to my knowledge, it's only been used once, and it gives the governor the authority to do this. So we're not even sure exactly whether the only thing the statute says is that the hearings aren't going to be public and aren't going to be disclosed to the public. It's I guess what's going to happen is the board will make a recommendation to the governor, and nobody will know what it is except the board and the governor. And it's not even clear if we're going to have he's going to have the right to counsel or the right to present witnesses, or whether that will be totally up to them as to what they do. So I assume they will we will be allowed to participate in some fashion, but there's a lot of unanswered questions as to how this is going to proceed.
Well, what are they reviewing? Like you said, the evidence shows that it's not Mr. Williams. What other details is this board going to be looking at?
The order appointing them said they can look at everything, both the evidence from the trial and any other evidence that's come to light. But the thing that I think history has taught us is that DNA is unassailable scientific evidence that proves you're innocent. Eyewitnesses can be mistaken. Jailhouse informants lie. There can be innocent explanations for circumstantial evidence. And even in cases where you've had detailed confessions, like the infamous Central Park 5 rape case that Trump wanted to execute them before their trial, that they were later exonerated by DNA, even though all 5 of them gave detailed confessions. So the point being, and no pun intended, is that DNA trumps all other forms of evidence.
What are your demands for your client?
Well, I think it's unlikely that there would be the political capital for him to pardon him outright, although he certainly has the power to do that. We would be happy if he would just vacate his convictions and allow the prosecutors to retry him if they want to get laughed out of court.
What kind of stuff can this trial teach us about the broader issues with the criminal justice system in America? Here at The Real News, we've been looking at it across the country in, different areas. Of course, we're in Baltimore. As you said, you're, in the same county as Ferguson. What kind of lessons or issues you think will come out of this case?
Well, I think the only thing that anybody can conclude about this case, I think, in the long run, is that the death penalty needs to be abolished, because as long as it's on the books, there are going to be innocent people convicted of capital crimes, and there are going to be innocent people get the death penalty, and there are going to be innocent people executed. And that's the only way to solve the problem, because anytime you have an infallible system, it's going to make mistakes.
Yeah. I was reading one interesting thing about this particular case, and that is the woman who was murdered, the reporter. She was not in favor of the death penalty. Have you talked to any of her family during this process at all?
Well, actually, the victim had recently left her job as a reporter for the Post-Dispatch newspaper in St. Louis to do volunteer work for in the inner city and on behalf of the underprivileged. So I don't know for a fact that she was against the death penalty, although it would appear that she probably would have been. But there was an op-ed in the Washington Post right before Marcellus's 2015 execution date, which we got stopped to do this DNA testing, where the new wife of her husband wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post that made peripherally mention this case and the pain it's caused them about the death penalty, but it was clear she was very much against the death penalty. And they have kept a low profile. They have not talked to the press, to my knowledge, at all. And there was an article this morning in the St. Louis paper, I believe, where the victim's husband has declined all press interviews, so he's not going public one way or the other about his.
Is it surprising that a Republican governor would step in after the Supreme Court denied the stay?
Yes, in a word, because I mean, as we all know, most Republicans are very pro-death penalty. Although that's a trend that's sort of changing, because if you think about the Republicans' basic philosophy that the government is bad, do you trust the government to select who the persons are that you should kill? So if you're an anti-government conservative, it would seem to me you would be against the death penalty, because the government is corrupt and makes mistakes. And do you trust them to select those people that deserve to be put to death? I would say that's a very Republican view, to be against the death penalty.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely going to be an interesting story to watch. I think just in getting the stay alone, it says a lot. These DNA cases say a lot about, the justice system and its vulnerability, I think, so we'll be following it, keeping our eye on it. We really appreciate you coming on the show and talking to us today, Kent.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching The Real News.